The wind howled outside, its sharp gusts rattling the windows of the old, creaking house. Evelyn Harper sat alone in her living room, nestled in her favorite armchair with a book in hand, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm, comfortable light across the room. It had been a long, exhausting day, and the silence of the house, though familiar, felt unsettling. She lived in the outskirts of town, far away from the noise of the city. The isolation had always been something she enjoyed, but tonight it seemed different. The house, old and weathered, felt alive in a way she couldn't explain. Every creak of the wooden floorboards beneath her feet, every groan of the house settling, was amplified in the stillness, making her feel like she wasn't alone, even though she clearly was. The wind picked up, moaning as it slithered through the cracks in the windows, sending a chill down Evelyn's spine. She tried to push the feeling aside and focus on her book, but the constant creaking and groaning of the house was getting to her. She glanced up at the shadows in the corners of the room, the dim light making everything appear just slightly off. The flicker of the street lamp outside cast strange, shifting shadows across the walls. She shook her head. She was imagining things. The house was old. It always made noises. She told herself that, but still, a tiny seed of doubt gnawed at her, growing with each passing minute. Then, there it was again. A faint sound like footsteps coming from somewhere upstairs. Soft at first, barely noticeable. She froze, the book still in her hands, her heart skipping a beat. She had been alone all evening. No one was here. The sound came again, louder this time, a steady pace as if someone was walking across the floor above her. She stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. It could be the house settling, she thought, trying to reassure herself. But the sound came again, closer, louder. A slow, deliberate tread, heavy and unmistakable. She was sure of it now. Someone, or something, was upstairs. Her heart started pounding in her chest. The chill that had crept up her spine deepened, and without thinking, Evelyn reached for her phone, desperate for something familiar. She needed to hear the voice of her best friend, someone, anyone, to help calm her nerves. She tapped her friend's name on the screen and held the phone to her ear. The ringing echoed in the quiet house, louder than it should have been. It seemed to go on forever, each second stretching into a lifetime. Then, just as the phone began to pick up, the line went dead. Silence. She pulled the phone away from her ear and stared at the screen, confusion flooding her mind. The call had cut out. She tried again, her fingers trembling as she dialed once more. But the second attempt was met with nothing. The line went completely dead. Evelyn pulled the phone away from her ear again, frowning, heart racing. She stared at the screen. There it was, an unknown number now flashing on the display. A sense of unease gripped her as she hesitated. She had never seen this number before. Maybe it was a telemarketer, or worse, a prank call. But something told her to answer it. Slowly, her hand trembled as she swiped the screen to pick up the call. "Hello?" Evelyn's voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. She didn't expect an answer. But then there was a voice. It was distant, faint, but it was there. It made her blood run cold. "They're inside your house," the voice whispered, its tone soft but cold, the words stretching into a sickening slowness. The voice felt familiar, but she couldn't place it, and yet it made every hair on the back of her neck stand up. The words, those 4 terrifying words, echoed in her head like a warning. Her mouth went dry. Her breath hitched in her throat. Evelyn immediately hung up, her hands shaking as she gripped the phone. She couldn't catch her breath. It had to be a prank, she told herself. It had to be. Who would do something like that? She laughed nervously, trying to shake the fear crawling up her spine. But as she put the phone down on the table, she heard it. A loud crash from upstairs, like something heavy being knocked over. Her stomach dropped. The footsteps, those strange, unsettling footsteps, had stopped. But the crash, it felt too real, too deliberate. And then, just as she turned toward the stairs, she saw it. At the top of the staircase, a shadow stood, motionless, watching her. It was tall, far too tall, and it blended into the darkness of the upper floor. Evelyn's heart stopped. She blinked, trying to convince herself it was just a trick of the light, but when she looked again, it was still there. The shadow hadn't moved. It just stood there, eerily still. She stared, her breath caught in her throat. Something about it made her feel sick to her stomach. It was like it was waiting for her to make a move. Her legs refused to move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a presence. She knew it. The longer she looked, the more she felt like it was growing, reaching for her. Her hands trembled. She took a step back, but when she blinked, the shadow vanished, completely. She felt her pulse pounding in her ears, the fear now palpable. No, she told herself, no way was she imagining this. It had been there. It had to have been. Evelyn took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. She wasn't going crazy. She was just tired. Maybe she was imagining things. The house was old. She was just hearing things. She turned her back to the stairs, telling herself it was just the wind, or maybe her mind playing tricks on her. That's when it came again. A deafening crash from the hallway. This time, it was closer. Much closer. She spun around, her heart pounding, her stomach twisting into knots. The sound of something being thrown, something breaking. The house groaned around her, the floorboards creaking, the windows rattling. She grabbed her phone in a frenzy, hands slick with sweat as she dialed 911. The number rang, and each tone seemed to echo louder and louder in the quiet house. Her head spun with panic. What was happening? What was going on? 911? What's your emergency? The calm, neutral voice on the other end of the line only made Evelyn's terror worse. They're inside my house. Please, they're here. Evelyn's voice cracked, her breath ragged. She could hardly get the words out. She could hear the footsteps now, unmistakable. Heavy, deliberate, moving toward her. She could hear them in the hallway, growing louder, coming closer. Her vision blurred with panic. She was trapped. She was alone. She needed help. But what could anyone do? What if no one arrived in time, before the dispatcher could say anything? Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The unmistakable sound of footsteps moved steadily toward her, and then silence. Everything went dead silent. The air grew still. She was left in the emptiness, her heart hammering in her chest, trying to grasp onto something familiar. But it was too late. The footsteps stopped. Then, in the deepest, most unnatural silence, the whispers began again. The silence in the house was suffocating. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she gripped the phone to her ear. She could feel the weight of the air pressing down on her, heavy and thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The whispers had stopped for a moment, but she knew they were coming back, creeping up from the corners of her mind. She could hear them faintly, like a soft breeze stirring through the walls, but louder now, insistent and closer. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning every dark corner, every shadow, but she couldn't see anything. The figure on the stairs, that haunting silhouette, was gone, but she could feel it. She could feel something, someone watching her. She didn't know if it was the house, the shadows, or something worse, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The phone line crackled in her ear, snapping her out of her spiraling thoughts. Then a voice came through, calm, professional, like a lifeline thrown to her in the middle of a storm. 911, what's your emergency? The voice belonging to Sarah Mitchell was steady, but Evelyn could hear the edge of concern in it. Evelyn gasped for air, her voice breaking as she spoke. They're inside my house. I don't know what's happening. The noises, the whispers. There's something here, something wrong. Her words tumbled out in a frantic mess, the panic choking her throat. Stay with me, Evelyn, Sarah said, her tone soothing but firm. Lock all doors and windows. Do you have a lock on the door? Evelyn nodded, even though she knew Sarah couldn't see her. She scrambled to double-check the lock on the front door, but as she moved, the whispers returned, louder, sharper. They seemed to float through the air, a cold breath brushing against her skin. They were right there, in the room with her, seeping through the walls, through the very air she breathed. Her stomach twisted with fear. She had done what Sarah asked, but the fear clawing at her was so much worse than she could explain. The house wasn't just creaking, and the wind wasn't just howling outside. Something else was here. Something darker. Something hungry. I can't stand this, Evelyn gasped, clutching the phone tighter. Something's in here with me. I can't explain it, but it's worse than anything I've ever felt. She could hear Sarah speaking calmly on the other end, telling her that help was on the way, but Evelyn wasn't listening. Her attention was fixed on the corner of the room where the shadows seemed to pulse and shift. Her eyes snapped back to the phone, but the line began to crackle, and Sarah's voice cut out intermittently. The air felt thick, like a fog was rolling in, muffling everything. The crackling grew louder, sharper, until it filled the room with an unsettling hiss, almost as if something was trying to speak to her. A loud bang echoed from somewhere in the house, so close it rattled her teeth. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. It was as if someone had thrown something heavy against the wall. She turned, her heart nearly stopping as she scanned the hallway. There was no one there, but the weight of the silence after the bang felt wrong. It felt like it was waiting for her to make a mistake, to look away for just a second. "Evelyn," Sarah's voice cut through the static, strained but still trying to reassure her. "Stay with me. I'm sending help now." But Evelyn couldn't focus. The whispers were louder now, curling around her like invisible fingers, scratching at her ears, pulling her attention to them. They were speaking directly into her mind, a twisted, hissing voice that seemed to grow from within her own thoughts. "Evelyn, they're coming for you." The words echoed in her mind, chilling her to the bone. They didn't just come from the phone. They came from the room around her, from the walls, the shadows. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She whipped her head around, her eyes locking on the top of the staircase. There it was again, the figure. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was clearer now, a twisted silhouette, too dark to see details but too familiar to ignore. It was her, or at least it looked like her. But something was terribly wrong. The shape stood perfectly still at the top of the stairs, the outline of a person but with unnatural proportions, too tall, too thin, with elongated limbs that didn't belong. Its eyes, hollow and empty, seemed to burn through her, staring into her very soul. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared, frozen in terror. It was like looking at a reflection in a broken mirror. Familiar, yet distorted, wrong. A scream tried to break free from her lips, but she couldn't make a sound. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if watching her, studying her. Evelyn could feel her pulse racing, her limbs trembling. Was it her imagination? No. It was real. It was in her house. The line crackled again, Sarah's voice barely audible over the static. "Evelyn, stay with me, please. Are you okay?" But Evelyn couldn't answer. She couldn't look away from the figure. Her body wouldn't move. It was as if she were paralyzed, trapped in the moment, unable to do anything but watch. She opened her mouth to scream, but before the sound could leave her throat, the figure moved. It didn't just step forward. It was as if it melted into the darkness, gliding silently down the stairs with an unnatural fluidity, its movements smooth and quick. The coldness in the air seemed to follow it, spreading like a fog. Evelyn couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was stare as the figure drew closer, closer. And then it stopped, just a few feet away from her. Evelyn's body went cold, her mind scrambling for any escape, any way out. She reached for her phone again, but the whispers were too loud now, too close. The voice that had been in her ear, Sarah's reassuring tone, was drowned out by a familiar haunting sound. The voice of the figure at the top of the stairs, twisted, whispering her own name. "Evelyn?" Her heart stopped. The figure's lips didn't move, but the voice was unmistakable. It wasn't Sarah anymore. It wasn't anyone she knew. It was hers. Her own voice, but wrong. Twisted. The words echoed in her skull, louder and louder until they drowned out everything else. Her vision blurred with terror. She couldn't take it anymore. She screamed, her voice hoarse and strangled. Without thinking, she dropped the phone, scrambling toward the door, her legs moving on their own, her body not willing to listen to the warnings in her head. But as she grabbed the door handle, the phone line went dead. A horrible, unnatural silence followed. And then, the phone rang again. She picked it up, hands shaking, her mind spinning. "Hello," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Nothing. Silence. Absolute silence. Then, just as she thought she was going to lose her mind, the whispers began again, closer now, right behind her. Evelyn's hands shook violently as she fumbled with the locks on the front door, her breathing ragged and uneven. The whispers were all around her now, a constant hum that seemed to crawl under her skin, burrowing deep into her thoughts. Every sound in the house felt amplified, like the walls were closing in, squeezing the life out of her. She bolted every door, locked every window, but no matter what she did, the house didn't feel secure. The shadows kept moving, flickering, just beyond her vision. Every time she turned, she felt the weight of something watching her, something waiting. She reached the back door, her hands fumbling for the lock, and that's when she saw it. There, sitting on the mantel, an old photograph she didn't remember seeing before. Her stomach dropped. It was a picture of a man she didn't recognize, his face sharp and cold. David Fletcher, the name written in faded ink at the bottom of the photo. But what made her blood run cold wasn't the name. It was the way the man's eyes seemed to follow her, shifting, moving ever so slightly as she stood there. The longer she stared, the more it felt like the eyes were alive, tracking her every movement. Evelyn felt a wave of dizziness rush over her. She had to look away. She couldn't take it anymore. She stumbled backward, trying to catch her breath. The house felt wrong, like it was bending, shifting, warping into something it wasn't. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, pressing against her chest. She turned toward the mirror on the hallway wall and froze. Her reflection, her own face, wasn't right. The woman in the mirror was her, but not. Her eyes were too wide, too blank, her lips twisted into a smile she hadn't made. The person in the mirror looked like her, but the expression, it wasn't hers. Her heart slammed against her ribcage. She turned quickly. The mirror's reflection still burned into her mind. She couldn't stop shaking. The house was alive. She had to get out. She had to find a way to escape this nightmare. She bolted down the hall, every step feeling like it was dragging her deeper into the abyss. The whispers seemed to swirl around her, a maddening chorus of voices calling her name, her own name, distorted and wrong. Evelyn, her mind raced. She was losing control. The house was playing tricks on her. It wasn't just the noise, it was everything. She couldn't trust her eyes anymore. The walls shifted. The floors creaked beneath her, the house groaning as if it were alive. It was like the place had a mind of its own, and it was coming for her. She reached the kitchen, her body trembling with dread, when she heard it again, a voice. Her name, whispered softly, called from the kitchen. She froze, terror clawing at her chest. Evelyn. It wasn't just the whispers. This was something different, something personal, something that came from inside her own thoughts. She couldn't take it. She couldn't breathe. Without thinking, she stumbled toward the basement door. She had never been down there. It was locked tight. Always locked. But now it was slightly ajar. The cold air that seeped through the crack chilled her to the bone. She stood there, paralyzed, staring at the darkness inside. Something moved in the shadows, something quick, something low. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as the sound of footsteps echoed from within. Then, another sound. A low, guttural scrape that sent shivers down her spine. Her body refused to move. She wanted to run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the basement door. The noises came again, closer now. A figure moved across the dark floor, so fast it was almost a blur. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She had to leave. She had to get away from whatever that thing was. She turned to run, but before she could make it, the basement door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. The sound rang in her ears, making her heart race even faster. Frozen, she turned around and found herself standing in front of the hallway mirror again. The reflection staring back at her wasn't hers. Not anymore. The face in the mirror was a twisted version of herself, a distorted, hollow version that grinned back at her with an expression that made her stomach churn. Her eyes were cold, lifeless, like they weren't even hers. She stepped back, terror flooding her chest. She wanted to scream, to run, to get away from the thing that had replaced her, but her legs wouldn't move. Her reflection reached out from the mirror, its hand coming too close. The figure grinned wider, its smile stretching unnaturally across its face, and Evelyn knew, deep down, it wasn't her. It was something else. Something that looked like her but wasn't. Something that had taken her place. The air in the house grew heavier, suffocating, and she felt the whispers surge around her again. Evelyn? The voice wasn't just in her head anymore. It was in the room, surrounding her, pressing in on her. She felt the temperature drop as the figure in the mirror reached for her. The world spun around her as she backed away slowly, her breath quickening, her thoughts racing in all directions. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the darkness around her seemed to close in. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The reflection reached out for her, and she felt a cold hand grip her wrist, icy, lifeless. Her own hand, or its hand. The shadow was moving closer. She had no way out. And just as she thought she couldn't take another second of the darkness, the whispers stopped. Everything went still. The silence pressed against her like a weight. The house was waiting. The silence in the house was thick, suffocating. Evelyn's heart raced as she stood frozen, staring at the thing in the mirror. The figure, her own reflection, but twisted, stepped forward. Its grin widened, stretching too far across its face, its eyes gleaming with something dark. "You think you can run?" it whispered, its voice twisted and mocking. "You think you can escape me?" Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to fight, but her body refused to obey. The reflection knew everything about her deepest fears, her darkest memories. It was as if it had always been there, watching, waiting. It wasn't just an image in the glass anymore. It was real. Too real. The reflection reached out, its fingers brushing against the cold mirror, but its eyes never left hers. "You're not real," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "You're just a trick, a dream." The doppelganger laughed softly, the sound more chilling than any scream. "Trick? Oh no, Evelyn. I've always been here. I've been with you, feeding off your fear, your doubts, your anger. I've been waiting for the right moment, and now I'm strong enough to take your place." Evelyn's mind spun. She couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to bend. The floor beneath her feet cracked with a loud snap. It was as though the house itself was coming to life, responding to the creature standing before her. The doppelganger's eyes gleamed, watching her struggle, its smile never fading. "Everything you've ever feared, everything you've ever doubted, it's all been me, Evelyn. I'm the shadow in the corner of your mind, the dark thought you can't escape. You've fed me for years, and now it's time for me to take what's mine." The words echoed in Evelyn's mind, growing louder with each passing second. She couldn't think straight. Was this real? Was she dreaming? Was she losing her mind? She tried to push past the terror back, but it felt like the house was closing in on her, trapping her. The walls were alive, pulsing like they were breathing. The room shifted, flickering in and out of focus. "You don't understand," the doppelganger whispered, its voice curling around Evelyn's mind. "I've been with you for as long as you can remember. The fear, the doubt, the loneliness, everything you've ever felt, I've been here. You never had control. It was always me, pulling the strings." Evelyn's mind flashed to the old photograph on the mantel. The man, David Fletcher. She had seen his face, hadn't she? The photo wasn't just a coincidence. The doppelganger knew what she was thinking, as if it could read her mind. "You remember him, don't you?" it asked, its voice dripping with malice. "David Fletcher. He was here before you. He tried to leave this place, tried to escape. But the house, the curse, it didn't let him go, just like it won't let you." Evelyn's blood ran cold. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This thing, this twisted version of herself, had been feeding off her fears for years. It was the one responsible for everything, the strange noises, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. It had always been here, pulling the strings, making her question what was real. And now it was ready to take over. Her mind raced. Was she ever in control? Had she ever been? Every memory, every moment she thought she understood, it all felt like a lie. She had been living with this thing inside her, and now it wanted to take her place. It was too strong now. There was no escaping it. The doppelganger stepped closer, its cold hand reaching out toward her. "You can't run from me, Evelyn. You never could. The house is mine, and so are you." Panic gripped Evelyn's chest. She tried to move, to run, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The walls began to close in, the air thick with a crushing pressure. The house was alive, and it was trapping her. She could feel it tightening around her like a noose. Her reflection in the mirror stepped forward, its grin widening impossibly, and Evelyn knew there was no way out. She was trapped. The creature had taken control, and she was nothing more than a pawn in its game. The floor beneath her cracked open, and Evelyn stumbled, barely catching herself. The house seemed to breathe, the walls pulsating with a life of their own. She could hear the whispers again, louder now, all around her, pressing in from every direction. "Evelyn?" The voice was everywhere. It was her own voice, but wrong. Twisted. "Evelyn, it's time." The doppelganger's hand reached out, and Evelyn felt herself being pulled toward it, toward the thing that had been with her all along. There was no escape, no hope. She was trapped in the house with her own worst nightmare, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As she struggled, trying to break free, the room seemed to twist and warp around her. The walls closed in, the shadows swallowed her whole, and the last thing she heard was the doppelganger's mocking laughter. And then there was nothing. Only silence. Evelyn's heart was racing, her mind screaming for an escape, but her body wouldn't respond. The doppelganger's cold fingers tightened around her wrist, pulling her through the house, down the dark hallway. She struggled, trying to break free, but it was like the house itself was holding her captive. Every step felt heavier, as if the floors were sinking beneath her feet. When they reached the basement door, the doppelganger threw it open, and the stench of damp, rotten air hit Evelyn's nose. The basement was dark, the shadows pressing in from every corner, but the whispering, that horrible whispering, seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't just in her head anymore, it was real. The house was alive. Do you hear them? The doppelganger's voice echoed in the darkness. The whispers? They're not just me. They are the house. It's alive, Evelyn, and it's feeding on you, on your fear. The temperature dropped so quickly that Evelyn's breath turned into mist. The air was cold, almost freezing, and it was hard to breathe. The walls seemed to close in, and she could feel the weight of the house pressing against her chest, squeezing the air out of her lungs. The whispering grew louder, and it felt like the house itself was speaking to her, its words curling around her mind like smoke. "Who are you?" Evelyn gasped, barely able to speak through the icy cold that gripped her. She tried to step back, but the doppelganger shoved her forward, deeper into the basement. And then she saw it. A figure stepped out of the shadows, and Evelyn's blood froze. It was David Fletcher, but not like she had seen him before. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and empty, as if his soul had been sucked right out of him. His skin was pale, and his body moved strangely, jerking in unnatural ways. The whispering seemed to come from him, his lips never moving, but the sound of his voice filled the room. "Evelyn," David's voice rasped, his mouth barely opening. "It's too late. The house has claimed you. It's always been this way. It will always be this way." Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest. "What do you mean? What is this place? What is happening to me?" David's empty eyes stared at her, and for a moment, Evelyn thought she saw something dark, flashing in them. The house isn't just a house. It's alive. It feeds off fear and regret. It twists those who enter, takes their souls, and changes them. I was like you once. I thought I could escape. But the house, it won't let you go. It won't let any of us go. Evelyn tried to back away, but the walls of the basement began to shift, moving closer to her. She couldn't tell if it was the house or if it was her mind playing tricks, but the whole room felt like it was closing in on her, suffocating her. The floor creaked, the air was thick with dread, and she could feel the darkness pressing on her from all sides. David's figure twisted, changing, shifting into something darker, something more monstrous. His body contorted, stretching out of shape as his skin seemed to melt away, revealing something horrible underneath. The creature, once David, was now a nightmare, its form no longer human. It was the Whisperer. "The house is a part of me," the Whisperer hissed, its voice a low growl that vibrated through Evelyn's bones. "And now, so are you. You'll never escape. Your fear feeds me. Your despair gives me strength." Evelyn stumbled back, her breath ragged. She wanted to scream, to run, but there was no way out. The walls were closing in, the air growing colder by the second. The Whisperer was right. She had always been a part of this place. It had been feeding off her fear all along, and now it was too late. "Please," Evelyn whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't want this. I don't want to become you." The Whisperer laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the basement. "It's already too late. You are already mine." Evelyn's vision blurred as her mind spun. David, no, the thing that had been David, was right. She wasn't the first to fall. The house had claimed others before her, twisted them into something unrecognizable. And now she was next. She was already being changed, her soul already slipping away, piece by piece. With a sudden jolt, the basement door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. She tried to reach for the handle, but it was no use. The door wouldn't open. The house had sealed her in, just like it had sealed all the others. Evelyn turned back toward the creature in front of her, her knees shaking. The Whisperer's eyes gleamed, its smile widening impossibly. "You cannot escape," it whispered, its voice low and dark. You will become part of the house. You will become just another twisted reflection in its halls, just like all the others. Evelyn's heart sank. There was no escape. There never had been. The house had already claimed her. The darkness around her deepened, the shadows growing thicker, and as she felt herself slipping away, consumed by the house, the last thing she heard was the whispering, wrapping around her like a cocoon. "Evelyn, you are mine." And then, everything went black. Evelyn's heart was pounding in her chest, every breath shallow and ragged as she stood in the dark basement, trapped by the twisted creature that had once been David. The walls seemed to be pressing in closer, the darkness thickening around her like a suffocating blanket. She felt the weight of the house closing in, its power growing stronger with every passing second. The whispering was deafening now, echoing in her mind, filling her thoughts with fear and doubt. The doppelganger's cold laughter rang out, cruel and mocking. "You think you can escape? You've been living in a nightmare, Evelyn. Every step you've taken led you here. This house, it's not just a building. It's a living thing, a parasite that feeds on fear and regret. And you, my dear, are its next meal." Evelyn's legs were trembling, her body weak from the cold and the pressure of the house around her. Her mind was spinning, trying to process the truth, but everything felt wrong, like the ground was slipping out from under her. The house was alive. It had been feeding off her all along, and now it wanted her soul, her very essence. The doppelganger, her twisted reflection, stepped closer, its grin widening. "You're already a part of this house," the doppelganger continued, its voice dripping with malice. "Just like David Fletcher, the house took him, and it will take you too. You're nothing but a vessel for its hunger. And when it's done with you, it will spit you out, just like all the others." Evelyn felt her knees give way, but she caught herself on the cold concrete floor, her hands shaking. She wasn't sure how much longer she could stand. The house was changing her, twisting her, just like it had done to the others. It was feeding off her fear, feeding off her regret, and there was no way out. But then, something inside her snapped. A surge of defiance, a flicker of strength that hadn't been there before. She couldn't let the house win. She couldn't let it take her. Not like this. With a desperate cry, Evelyn pushed herself up, glaring at the doppelganger. "I won't let you take me," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "I won't let this house win." The doppelganger's face twisted in a mockery of a smile. "You don't have a choice. You're already part of it. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide." Evelyn stumbled backward, her eyes scanning the dark room. Her breath came in quick gasps as she searched for any way out. That's when she saw it. A narrow door hidden behind a pile of old crates, its edges barely visible in the dim light. She didn't know why, but something told her that this door might be the key to everything. Without thinking, she bolted toward it, the doppelganger's voice echoing behind her. "You can't escape. It's too late. The house owns you now." Evelyn ignored it, her heart racing as she reached for the door. She pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic clawed at her chest, but she didn't stop. She threw her weight against the door, again and again, until finally it creaked open. Inside was a small, hidden room. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in strange symbols and artifacts. It looked ancient, as though it had been untouched for years, but there was something unsettling about it, something that made Evelyn's skin crawl. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though the house itself was warning her to leave. But Evelyn stepped inside anyway. She needed answers. She needed to know the truth about this place, about the curse that had trapped her here. As she moved deeper into the room, the temperature dropped even further, the air growing heavier with every step. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse, shifting and changing as if they were alive. And in the center of the room, she saw a strange old book resting on a pedestal, its pages yellowed and torn. It looked ancient, like it had been there for centuries. The doppelganger's voice rang out, louder now. "You think this will help? It's useless. The house already has you." Evelyn ignored it. She reached for the book, her hands trembling as she opened it. The pages were filled with strange writings, and as she read, she began to understand. This house was no ordinary place. It was a living entity, a creature that fed off fear and regret, trapping souls and twisting them into something unrecognizable. And it had been doing this for centuries. There was no escape, no way out. But then, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, in the pages of the book, was a mention of the doppelganger. It wasn't just a reflection, it was part of the house itself, a manifestation of its power. And it was tied to Evelyn, tied to her soul. If she didn't fight back, the house would consume her completely, and she would become just another twisted reflection in its halls. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just fighting for her life anymore. She was fighting for her soul. The room began to warp around her, the walls twisting and bending as though the house was trying to drag her back into its grip. Evelyn's heart raced. She had to act fast. With a cry of desperation, she slammed the book shut, and the room seemed to shudder, the air thickening. The doppelganger's laughter echoed around her, cruel and mocking. "You can't escape," it hissed. "It's already over." But Evelyn wasn't done yet. She could feel the house, its power, its hunger. She knew what she had to do. With all the strength she could muster, Evelyn pushed forward, charging at the doppelganger. The house seemed to fight against her, the walls closing in, but she fought back, using every ounce of willpower she had left. The doppelganger lunged at her, but Evelyn managed to sidestep, shoving it aside. She could feel the house beginning to crumble, the walls shaking as if it were falling apart. In that final, terrifying moment, the basement door slammed shut behind her, locking her in. She didn't know if she had won or lost. She didn't know if she had escaped. But one thing was certain: the house was collapsing around her, its grip finally loosening. And in that moment, Evelyn knew that whatever happened next, she had fought until the very end. The house fell silent. There was no more laughter, no more whispers. The walls, once alive with the sounds of the house's twisted hunger, now stood still as if everything had stopped. The air was thick, but it no longer carried the same weight of fear and despair. The house had consumed its latest victim. Evelyn was gone. Outside, the world continued as it always had. The night sky was dark, and the wind blew softly, carrying the echoes of the past. The house, though, was different. It was empty now, save for the photographs on the walls. Each one had once been of a person, but now they were all twisted. Their faces were distorted, their smiles contorted into dark, sinister shapes. The victims, now lost to the house, had become part of its curse. The house had taken them, just like it had taken everyone else. The police arrived the next morning, but they found nothing. No signs of struggle, no traces of Evelyn, nothing to explain her disappearance. They searched the house from top to bottom, but it was as though she had never been there. The only thing left was the strange, unsettling feeling in the air. The feeling that something had happened, but no one could figure out what. Officer Pierce and Michael Calloway left the house that day, shaking their heads, unable to make sense of what had happened. They spoke in hushed tones as they drove away, both of them troubled by the strange disappearance. But they would never understand. The house had already moved on, already waiting for its next victim. And Evelyn, once so alive, had become nothing more than a memory, lost to time. As the police drove away, the camera slowly panned back to the house. The front door was still open, the house standing silently in the distance. The photos on the walls seemed to shift in the breeze, and as the camera lingered, one of the photos came into view, Evelyn's photo. But it was no longer a picture of her as she once was. The image had changed. Her smile was twisted, her eyes dark and hollow. She had become like the others, a part of the house, a part of its endless curse. Her smile seemed to follow them as they left, and the whispers, faint but unmistakable, started again. They echoed on the wind, a soft, unsettling sound. The house had already claimed another soul, and it would wait for the next one. And just like that, the cycle began again.